problem identification and conceptualization. Let us try to see the connection between our literature review and the problem. But let's try talking about the problem first. So the problem is basically a gap between what is and what ought to be. So we've seen this one in the bridge concept of research. And that's the reason why we need to, one, find out why the information is being sought, why it's important, to determine whether the information already exists, to determine whether the question really can or should be answered, to use exploratory research to define the background of this problem, even a problem analysis, to look at the situation analysis. And here we can apply the iceberg principle of the fraction of the floating iceberg is only visible, whereas a bigger portion is under the water and therefore can be explored further, understood more, and to determine relevant variables. So these are the things that we can consider. Now, a problem statement, this is, of course, I'm coming from multiple PowerPoints already. I'm not really sure where already. So copyright belongs to whoever they're due. Is a move that a document makes to help the reader realize why that document is important. By the way, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, I hope you'd click that subscribe button so that you also help me push forward my goals. So the problem statements can be formal statements like thesis statements. Remember, you always argue for something, or informal statements like a sentence that tells readers how a new development will affect them. So these are problem statements. Of course, in academic research, it always constitutes a thesis statement. That's the general statement of the problem. And the general statement of the problem is not a question, but a statement. The specific questions are questions, but even the specific questions are rooted and grounded in the thesis statement. What a thesis statement is and why it's important is Googleable, and I trust that you'd consider what they are. So problem statements can be either formal, like a thesis statement, or informal, like an explanatory sentence. And their primary functions are to help the readers see why your document is important, what you're arguing about, and also help create or raise awareness of a particular issue. Strong problem statements consider, first and foremost, terminology, jargon, the use of the words, how they vary, concepts, shared beliefs and mindsets, and also canonical works or more important works. That's the reason why we do our RRL first. We need to be able to identify who contributed to this field. So that being the case, problems, as we know, are inevitable ingredients in human existence. We can perceive problems, experience problems, and cause and create problems. Ironically, research problems don't come that easy. Most starting researchers suffer from problem blindness. But that tells us simply that not all problems are researchable. I have some statements here from the military field, and I hope that you'd bear with me. For example, what is the essence of becoming a soldier? That's not a researchable question. At least the way military soldiers normally conduct their research, that's a philosophical question by all means, but not that type which the commandant's papers, for example, accommodate? Or how does the organization affect the leadership of soldiers? That's doable, but the how is really a very difficult question, as it presupposes the what first. What are the leadership styles of army officers? That's possible. But I'd rather like, to what extent do the army officers practice the following leadership styles? And then you start articulating what leadership styles you're interested in. Or what policies are in place about joint operations. Actually, these types of questions sounded like enumeration questions, and these are answered as almost immediately as you conduct your RRL, and therefore they're not research questions specifically. When you simply are saying what are the programs being implemented or what are the policies about this and that, these are RRL questions, and therefore are answered almost immediately after you conduct your literature review, and as such cannot constitute a research problem. Or what is the status of civil military operation? That is researchable. Relationships, of course, that's that's a correlation research, that's researchable. And lastly, as that is there significant difference in the CMO capabilities? That's like the example that we have shown in an earlier video, that is causal comparative. So based on my experience, for example, with military soldiers, officers or even teachers for that matter always come up already with solutions in mind. They already wanted, or they already know what the military needs or what schools needs. And that tells me, if anything, that you know the problem. But still, even if you know the problem because you've been immersed in the organization or in the school, you still need to provide empirical evidences that there is a problem. So the point of the research is to justify the solutions that you have in mind. But in order for us to be able to justify the solutions that you have in mind, you need to be able to provide us with empirical scientific evidence that the problem that you experience do exist. And that's why you need to take 2 steps back. Now, in taking 2 steps back, of course, there are things you have to take into consideration. For example, interest. Are you willing to commit yourself to that research? Having written researches, no, these are topics that you dream about, work with for a long period of time, even years for some, months, or even years for some. And therefore, you need to really have that level or degree of interest in order to pursue them. We need to take into consideration also size. Is it manageable? Is it doable for that matter? Is it economical in time and money? Do you have the resources to work on it? Your capabilities and limitations. You can't certainly do quantitative research if you don't know how to do quantitative research. These are 2 totally different things. If you don't like numbers, for example, that's just impossible. Or even we'll see that also in terms of uh, qualitative research, and also uniqueness, no? Of course, when I was younger, I was duplicating many researches, but it's also important not to duplicate, no? Well, we can do similar research, but differentiated in terms of methodology or even design or sample, or we can also perform different statistical analysis for that matter, no? So you can also start with theories or set of ideas. Easier, begin with those that are easy to begin with. The outcome might be a critique to the theory, suggestions how it can be modified or even extended. You can also look at potential and sufficient outcomes like valuable research results. Even if you plan to develop something in the end, which might not be achievable, the knowledge developed in the process still has contribution. And of course, it needs it is to not biased, safe, and even ethical. Be objective again as much as possible, even for those who are doing qualitative research where the researcher is part of the data gathering tool, not causing discomfort or even harm to anyone or anything, whether that's social, emotional, or even physical. So to ask, is the problem researchable? We need to be able to look at whether the question includes, has the problem been specified? Is it very clear what the problem is? Is the problem researchable, amenable to research? Is the problem too large to work with? Of course, that will vary between an undergraduate and a graduate type of research. Is the data available, or is the data not available? Or are we capable of solving the problem or not? Even those needs to be considered by the researcher. Note, though, that when the idea is converted to a question, a general statement is posed. So the general statement is called a general statement or a general problem because the researcher cannot immediately answer these questions employing the methodology at his disposal. So the general statement of the problem cannot be any of the specific statements of the problem. No? And this is something we need to pay attention to. Sometimes we think that the general statement of the problem is the same as the specific statement of the problem, but that's not true. This being the case, the researcher would have first to legitimize the problem in theory. And that's why in legitimizing the problem in theory, you end up conceptualizing. Uh, of course, we need to see that the research has many functions. One, to clarify an existing theory. Two, to clarify contradictory findings. Three, to correct a faulty methodology. Four, to correct the inadequate or unsuitable use of statistical techniques. To reconcile conflicting opinions and to solve existing practical problems. You can actually aim at depending also on what you can work on. So this is where your literature review comes in, no? Based on conceptualization. For instance, a concept we need to understand cannot be understood directly without ignoring the dimensions of that concept. For example, warfighting capability can be approached using what the military always uses, MPLF, Doctrine, Organization, Training, Material, Personnel, Leadership, and Facilities. Or there might be theories that suggest that gender, age, education, or work can influence work orientation and leadership styles. Those two are moderating variables, if I may use a more scientific reference to them, but also parts of a research process. So, but but the idea all comes from the literature review. Now, from these theories, you can adapt the variables to use that you can factor into the specific problems in order to make an inference on the influences of these on the phenomenon to be investigated. So the next thing to do is to establish the theoretical and literary foundation of the study in the review of related literature. The RRL, therefore, provides legitimacy to the study as it gives a theoretical account and support of the reality of the phenomenon being investigated and the interrelationship of different variables that shape such phenomenon. It also provides a basis for the choice of the variables, methods, and measures. No? Even the research design will come from the RRL, and even how you translate it to measures, no? Statistical measures, whether it's going to be a nominal, ordinal, interval, or ratio, will depend also on the RRL. So the RRL weaves the various threads that constitute the texture of the phenomena under investigation. So the RRL is not arranged according to types of literature as it was before, books, journals, policies, international and local. No, we we've been setting that aside for a very long time. Instead, we wanted it thematized according to the variables of the statement of the problem, as we have demonstrated in an earlier video. Every concept is defined using international and local literature, utilizing either books, journals, or policies. And the more local literature is engaged in the construction of such concepts, the more operationalized, the more concretized they become. So in the absence of a formal or academic theory that is enough to represent how the study will proceed, a conceptual framework will be adopted. No? And that's why it's called conceptual framework versus a theoretical framework. A theoretical framework is a adaptation of a theory in toto, whereas a conceptual framework is an adaptation of multiple theories to represent that which is being studied. So in a conceptual framework, therefore, the use of the variables and the interrelationship of the variables are treated in the study have to be depicted or illustrated like a researcher's roadmap. For me, it's a concept map more than the IPOO. In some studies, we don't actually use the IPOO for the conceptual framework. Instead, we use a conceptual map to demonstrate how the different concepts and variables are related in the study. The IPOO is used more as a research framework than a conceptual framework. So, if the RRL is chapter 2 or we have a theoretical and conceptual framework, this is going to be a pendulum movement from the statement of the problem and the theoretical or conceptual framework or the RRL. It's a pendulum movement. Okay? So the underlying assumption is that the whole is equal to the sum of its parts. That's the principle. So the general problem is the whole, and the specific problems comprise its parts. The assumption sets the stage, of course, for asking the questions that are logical. So the nature of the whole will dictate the nature of the parts. Check your general statement of the problem. Is your general statement of the problem reducible to problem 1 or 2 when you have 3 problems? Because if it's reducible to specific problem number 1 or specific problem number 2 when you have 3 questions, that will render the third invalid. But if you have 3 and your general statement of the problem is the third, considering that the first 2 is necessary in order to arrive at the third, then your general statement of the problem can be like the last specific statement of the problem. This implies, of course, that when all of the specific problems are answered, then the general problem is answered. No? So that's the reason why you'd see that the statement of the problem here in gray is the same size as the research questions there. Of course, there's a final approach that's going on here, but the general statement of the problem and the specific statements of the problem must be comparable to each other. They have to be the same. That's the reason why when you look at the general statement of the problem and it's just problem number 1 or problem number 2, even if you have 3, that would render your problem number 3 useless. That would mean that if you're done with problem number 1, you've already answered the question, and therefore there's no need to study further, which is actually not the case. No? So this, for example, this study attempts to find out the relationship of the behavioral orientation of hospital administrators towards people and tasks on their leadership styles. So there are 3 things you need to know first in order to address the general problem. Please take note that this is a quantitative research, but even qualitative researches are patterned in exactly the same way. No? So what we can learn also from quantitative research, if you're used to doing qualitative research, but also we can learn from qualitative research if you're just used to doing quantitative research. So let's look at this. So when you look at the general problem about attempting to find out the relationship of the behavioral orientation of hospital towards people and tasks on their leadership styles, then there are 3 things we need to know. First, we need to know the behavioral orientation of hospital administrators. Second, we need to know the leadership styles of hospital administrators. And third, how the first is related to the second. So if you look at the general problem, it is one that entails correlation in inferential statistics, or one that looks at relationships. But to be able to do inferential stats, you need to do some descriptive statistics first, right? So, which would mean that the first and second things that you need to know here in this in this general problem is needed to answer the third. In a similar way, you need to present and describe qualitative data first before you analyze it. So asking how for problem number 1 is a no-no. In the English language, there are 4 W's and 1 H. You do not ask the H, the how first, as doing so will need understanding of the W first. So describe first before you ask the how. That's what I meant. So from the above 3, we can start formulating the specific questions. So the specific problems can be stated as: to what extent are hospital administrators oriented to people and tasks? It's interesting to note where people and tasks come from, and the answer to that is RRL. No? Second, to what extent do hospital administrators practice the following leadership styles: directing, supporting, coaching, and delegating? And the question is, where did A to D come from? And the answer there, of course, is also RRL. Then you can ask, what is the correlation between behavioral orientation and leadership styles of hospital administrators? Now, reflecting on the problems, of course, can generate more questions. You have to entertain these in order to complete the parts of the whole. Although important, these need not be articulated as SOP always, because that can enlarge the study. For instance, will you be expecting that all the hospital administrators will have the same behavioral orientation leadership styles? And the answer to that is a resounding no. The literature review will identify the factors that can cause a difference, and this is the time for you to consider what moderating or intervening variables to use. And therefore, we can complete the research problem into these 5 research problems. To what extent are hospital administrators behaviorally oriented to people and tasks? That's a script that will necessitate descriptive statistics, as you know. Is there a significant difference in the extent of the behavioral orientation of the hospital administrators according to gender, age, educational attainment, and years of experience, where A to D should be backed up by researches that says that behavioral orientations vary depending on gender, age, educational attainment, and years of experience. 3, to what extent do hospital administrators practice the following leadership styles, where A to D can come from a literature. And then 4, again, A to D, it should be backed up by research. And then also 5, correlating behavioral orientation and leadership styles should also be supported by literature, which means that if you wanted to correlate the two together, there has to be literature that correlated the two together already. So we can add more criteria to the development of a good research, such as finer. No? It has to be feasible, something doable, interesting, because writing is already difficult, novel, something new, ethical, you're not gonna abuse people or things like that, and it has to be relevant. We can expand the finer further, feasible, by looking at the subject, resources, is it manageable, is the data available, interesting, need not be emphasized enough, novel in relation to previous findings, does it confirm it, refute it, new setting, new population, are we can approach old topics using new methodologies, or new topic using old methodologies. Ethical, social, and scientific value, is it safe? And then relevant, advance scientific knowledge, influence clinical practice, impact health policy, and the like. So a research question must identify the variables under study, the population being studied, and the testability of the question. At the end of the problem formulation, the researcher should have enough background information in the field, good literature, and giving indication of the theoretical or practical significance of the study, and should be able to develop testable hypothesis, which means an answer to the question. There's a reason why sometimes when students come to me and I tell them answer problem statement number 1, they're shocked because they weren't expecting me to demand an answer to something they think is justified that they don't know, not in academic writing. So the hypothesis is a temporary intelligent answer, no? And it's normally stated as a directional one instead of a null hypothesis. Directional one is a anticipated answer, in fact. And I've written down that a research hypothesis is adapted, directional one is adapted, since the null hypothesis, is endemic to the use of any statistical tool. Thus, it is not adapted as the hypothesis of the study. The hypothesis provides a researcher with the expected answer. Although sometimes it's not written in the paper, the researcher must be aware of the data expected of them. And this one is also provided by the RRL. So the hypothesis is an intelligent one, no? That answers the question. And as I said, we already aim at the directional one versus a non-directional one. A research hypothesis instead of a null hypothesis. And looking at the answers, for example, or the questions that we raised, this is the hypothesis. You can pause the video if it's going too fast. But here you'd see answers, no, already. For example, to what extent are hospital administrators behaviorally oriented to people and tasks? When you say highly oriented, that you were able to identify that because of the RRL. That behavioral orientation can be a matter of high, moderate, or low, maybe. No, or instead of saying there's no significant difference, you already claim there's a significant difference because the inclusion of a particular intervening moderating variable is a consequence of an earlier study that declares already these A to D as a variable, intervening variable or moderating variable. No? And then 3 is about leadership styles, and it says moderately practiced. So that's in terms of extent. That's very interesting when you ask extent or status. And then again, the inclusion of A to D is a consequence of researches, and therefore there has to be significant difference. And then positively correlated, that will have to do also with how to interpret correlation, which we will look at when we have arrived at that section. So greater and greater level or degree of operationalization is required for the study to move forward. I'll stop it at this point. If you haven't subscribed yet to the channel, I hope you would. And see you in the next recording. Thank you.